Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. I am Cece Berger-Sharp. I'll be the presenter today. But before we get started, I'm going to pass it over to Allison Bauer-Wilner to kick off our webinar. Allison?
Hi, Cece. Thank you. I just want to welcome everyone to the call. My name is Allison Bauer-Wilner, and I am chairing the education group within MedTech Women at SEMDA. And I have worked closely with Jason Rupp to develop this webinar series. I also want to offer a special welcome to members of Mölnlycke Healthcare's business resource group called the Professional Women's Alliance. There are many members of that group that are joining us today to join our fellow Cece Berger-Sharp. And I also wanted to encourage all of you who are also women working in larger organizations to leverage this series of webinars to the advantage of the women in your organizations. Invite them to join these webinars as they are broadcast live each month, but also you can point them to our webinar series, which is hosted on the SEMDA site. All right, so as I mentioned, I'd like to welcome Cece Berger-Sharp. Cece has had many roles in the area of learning and development. She currently serves as the Vice President of Commercial Excellence here at Mölnlycke Healthcare. And Cece has had a long and prosperous career, 7 years, in the last 7 years spent in training and learning and development for adults. Cece also has a degree in chemical engineering from Purdue University, and she has held roles at both Kimberly-Clark and other organizations, including Mölnlycke Healthcare. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Cece and say, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this webinar for us on the topic of improving your effectiveness while presenting on phone and webinar. Cece?
Yes, thank you, Allison. And for those of you that are on the webinar, you can imagine I was very excited when Allison came and asked me to be a part of all of this. And then when we talked about the topic, I thought, oh, no pressure there. To give a webinar on how to give effective webinars, I better be on the top of my game. And so what you'll see as we go through this today is some of the tips and the tricks that I'm going to share with you are very simple. And the key to giving a good webinar is really to make sure that you do keep it simple, you keep it relevant, and you keep it engaging. So hopefully we'll be able to do that during our time together. And I'm just really excited to be able to offer something that hopefully all of you will be able to use. So now before we get started, for those of you that may have been on some of the SEMDA webinars before, you may be familiar with the platform that we're using, which is Zoom. For those of you that may not, I want to orient you a little bit. Obviously, you're seeing my face, I believe, as well as the screen that I'm presenting from. But this platform offers a lot of other functionality as well, including chat box and the ability to raise your hand to ask questions. So just to make sure that things are working and you know how to engage with us during this presentation, I'd like everybody to type hello into your chat box at this time. And because I can't see the chat box since I'm presenting, I'm going to rely on Allison and Jason, who are going to be my eyes on the chat box, to let me know that people are having an easy time writing in the chat box. Allison, are we seeing some responses?
We sure are. People are saying hello, Cece.
Awesome, awesome. Well, that's great. So now that I know that you know how to engage with me, we'll use that throughout the presentation. So I mentioned that my goal for today was to make sure that I kept this webinar simple, relevant, and engaging. But maybe what's some goals for all of you today? So what I would like to propose is that by the end of this webinar, that you all will learn 2 tips or best practices that you'll be able to use in your next webinar. So if you're willing to go for that goal with me, again, please type a Y into your chat box. And if you've ever done what's on my left-hand side of the screen and finished a tube of chapstick without losing it first, congratulations. So Allison, are we getting some yeses? Are people committed to trying 2 new things at their next webinar?
I see a lot of commitments to do that, Cece.
Awesome, awesome. So again, let's start with a quick poll question. So I'd like to know from all of you kind of your starting point and what your frequency with webinars and teleconferences is right now in your typical work week. So again, we'll use our chat box function. If you're doing 1 to 2 of these, please type A, 3 to 5, please type B, or 5 or more a week, type C. And Allison is going to take a very unscientific summary for me by seeing what we're getting the majority of as people type into the chat box. What are you seeing a lot of, Allison?
There's definitely a mixture, Cece. We see a lot of people doing 1 to 2, but we see a surprising number of people doing even 5 more.
Okay. So if we think about that and then think about the time that is over the course of a work week, for those of you who are in 1 to 2, that might be 1 to 2 hours. But for those of you who are exceeding maybe 5, maybe you are constantly remote because you have a remote location at your home and you have a home office somewhere else, that if you're getting above 5 and if all of them are an hour, you're talking a good chunk of your work week to be spent in a more technology-based platform to interact with your colleagues. And with that, you really want to be in a position where you can be effective because you're spending a lot of time. And the truth of the matter is, this technology is here to stay, so we might as well embrace it and learn how to do it and use it to our advantage. Now, one thing I will say, I've used many platforms over the years, from Skype to GoMeeting to now Zoom, my first interaction here, and many others. And it is so easy to hate the technology, especially when it doesn't work, and to get frustrated and to not want to use it again. However, it's often good to remember the advantages that come to us when we can get really good at webinars and teleconferences. If we're really good at this, it might be the instance where it lets us stay home and take a call and not have to fight traffic. Or maybe it allows us to take that global call in the middle of the night from the comfort of our own bed and still be effective. But whatever the case, as I said before, it's here to stay. And the better that we can get at it, the more effective our time outside of webinars will be as well. And to have an effective webinar, it really falls on both shoulders, not just the presenter. We'll be focused on the presenter today and some tips and tricks that you can do to keep your audience engaged. But there is also a commitment from the participants. And I am sure of you have thought, oh, but I can do it. I'm a multitasker. I can listen with one ear and I can type this email on a totally different subject with my other hand. But the fact of the matter is, it just ends up taking more time if you are not engaged. And the worst case scenario is ending a teleconference or a webinar saying, okay, well, I guess we'll just make that decision the next time we see each other in person. Because that means you've put something else on your to-do list and wasted the time that you spent on the webinar. So knowing that we all want to make the most effective use of our time, let's start to look at some of the tips and tricks that can help you have more effective webinar interactions. And as most of you can probably imagine, like most things, the preparation is the key to a great start. So let's take a look at some of this. The meeting notice. So long before you're ever in the room to give the webinar, the meeting notice is an important element. And one reason for this is all of these different technologies have different default settings. And you need to be aware of which ones you need to set for the interaction that will be most beneficial for you in your meeting. This could include settings that might mute all of your participants, or in some cases might not mute all of your participants. And you run into those interactions where you've got 100 people calling in and you can hear every dog barking from Maine to California. So checking on your technology is first and foremost what you want to do and become really familiar with it. To give an example of this, Zoom is a platform that I had not used before. And knowing that this webinar was about effective webinars, I wanted to make sure I knew all of the bells and whistles that came along with it. So Allison and Jason and I had a meeting last week where I was able to trial out all of the different options available to make sure that we had an effective interaction today. And one very, very simple thing is making sure you plug your computer in if you're going on a long webinar or if you have a lot of people coming on. It sounds silly, but I've been on webinars where the hosts lost their battery power at the most inconvenient times. So once we're set up with our technology, another good tip is to make sure that you're on the line a minimum of 30 minutes early. Again, this can adjust based on the size of the meeting that you're hosting. If it's a small team meeting that you do on a weekly basis, this probably isn't necessary. But if you're giving a webinar to a large number of people, you want that time to trial it. Again, we practice what we speak, what we preach. Allison and Jason and I were on at least a half an hour. And with 15 minutes to go, we were confident in all of the technology and that it would work, and got to have a really nice and pleasant catch up for the last 15 minutes with no stress. Third, a holding slide that lets people know they're in the right place. Now, this is something that was not as important with the Zoom technology because we had the ability to begin a broadcast right away. But oftentimes, if your companies use Skype, this is a really good tool to let people know they're in the right spot. So we added one to this webinar, and you saw it at the beginning when I said, we'll begin momentarily from Atlanta. You all knew you were in the right spot, and it avoided all of those clicks and beeps when people call in saying, hi, is anybody there? Am I in the right spot? Type a high five or a yes if that's ever happened at your webinars. And then last but not least, and definitely not least, probably the most important in the preparation, is assigning roles. So the good news about a webinar is you do not have to do it alone. And there's 3 key roles that I often like to have in my webinars. The first is a facilitator, somebody who is orchestrating the conversation, and if there's multiple presenters, they're queuing up everybody on when to go. The second, obviously, is the presenter of the content. And then third is having a technology guru on standby or perhaps in the room with you. This ensures that there's enough people to really galvanize themselves if there are any issues either before the call begins or during the call. With that, I'd like to know, before we go to the next slide, what tips or tricks you think I've tried on all of you so far in this webinar. So I'll give you a second to type them in while Allison and Jason look at the chat box. So Allison, as they're coming in, if you want to read us off some of the tips and tricks people think we've tried.
Sure. Some people are saying facilitator. Some people are saying all of them. Others have noticed the holding slide already and have noted that you've spent the time to understand Zoom as a technology, and also that you've demonstrated you got on early so that you'd be ready for the webinar.
Exactly. Now, those are some of the ones that I've already clued you into, but there's some other techniques that we're gonna discuss on the next page that I'd like to know if you guys think I've tried anything else on you before we go on to the next slide. So Allison, any others?
I see a note that we've assigned others in the room to assist, guests using the chat box, and asking questions to engage the audience comes up.
Yes.
Using video, and getting responses from all of the participants.
Excellent, excellent. Yes, so all of those are applicable. So let's kind of list them out and talk about why you would do each one. And what I like about this list that we're about to go through is they're really simple tips and tricks that once you know them, they aren't complex to execute. But if you're not aware that these can help, then you probably haven't tried them. So let's go through a few of them. And as I go through this list, I'm guessing some of you are already doing many of them, but hopefully there's one or two, because two is our goal, that you'll be able to try at your next webinar. So first, set a goal and check the goal. Everybody likes to know at the beginning of any call, teleconference, or webinar why they're there and what they might get out of it. So in the beginning, we set the goal of 2 new tricks, or 2 new tips, and you'll hear me reinforce that as we go through the call, reminding you of what you should get out of this. And then at the end, we'll check and see if we hit our goal and give an opportunity to reinforce or answer any questions to hit that goal if we haven't. Second, and I know many of you put this in, was explaining the technology and how I wanted you all to utilize it. That's really comforting to participants to know what to do. Even if they're familiar with it, some people run webinars in slightly different ways. So you want to get those ground rules out early and make sure that everybody is on board with them. Third, and this is another one that many of you typed into the chat box, add engagement early and often. If you have engagement planned, but it's 15, 20, 30 minutes into the engagement, people are less apt to engage with you then because they've got too settled in their seats. So you want them to engage with you first. You know that they're there, and then you can call upon them to engage with you later again when you need it. Which goes to the next point, is that when you have them engage early, wait until you get enough responses to show that you're serious. It's okay to continue to encourage people. If you know you have 50 people on a call, but only 10 people have sent in a response, it's an opportunity for you to call that out and say, looks like we've had 10 people respond. I want to make sure that all of you are able to use your chat box. Let's get up to 40 before we move on. So again, you're cluing everybody in to that engagement with you. And the last thing I will add with this is it's often good to start with an easy question at the beginning, one they can answer that is part of their own experience. So you saw me doing that with simply typing hello, answering yes if they were ready for the goal, and answering a question around how often you use webinars. All of those are not questions that require them to get an answer right, but is a quick answer that they can give and become a part of the conversation with you during the webinar. Next, clean slides that are light on text. It's human nature. If we start to see words, we read them. And especially on a webinar, and especially if you don't have video capability, it's very easy for participants to just go ahead and read their slide. And they definitely can read faster than you can speak. So you'll have people that are ahead of you and perhaps becoming impatient because they've gotten already what you want to say, but they may miss out on some of the stories that you were going to tell that go along with each point. One other thing that I'll say is clean slides that are light on text. I am very aware is a best practice, and I am really not that great at it. When I was preparing for this webinar, I knew exactly what I wanted to do, but I'm not that great at slides. So feel free to utilize resources around you who do have those skills. I'd like to thank my colleague, Stacy Miller, who helped me put this presentation together to make it more effective for you. Complementary pictures are another great addition. So you'll notice in our first 2 slides that when we showed that holding slide, I showed you a picture of the city of Atlanta. Now, technically, I'm a little bit north of Atlanta, but there aren't really skyline photos of Norcross, so I chose to use Atlanta. But that was actually a purposeful choice because I wanted you to know that I'm a real person in a city that maybe a lot of you are familiar with. In the same way, in the second slide, it showed a picture of me. Again, you don't have video. That's a way for people to get a feel of who the person is that's presenting to them and where they are, really humanizing the interaction, even though you're looking at a computer. Humor when appropriate. I threw in my little meme just to catch your attention. Now, not all presentations lend themselves to humor or a little bit of fun, but when you can, it's a very effective tool to make sure that people are engaged. And if you smiled for even a millisecond when you read the Will Ferrell quote, then that had you engaging with me, and I can capitalize on that attention. Two more that we'll go over before we pause to take some questions. And that one is use words that grab attention. On the last slide, you may have noticed that when I was talking about the best practices of who you need in a room, I very clearly stated, number one, a facilitator, number two, a presenter, and number three, a technology guru. The reason for that is when I start listing out things, but I very clearly delineate with numbers or with an A, B, and C, it's attention grabbing. This can be really effective too when you're just using teleconferences and you really want to make sure they're engaging. Other phrases that grab people's attention are, if you remember one thing from this webinar, I want you to remember to use words that grab attention. Or, if I had you write one thing down that I don't want you to forget. So all phrases like that grab attention and make people pause and listen to your next point. And then last but not least, it's always good to mix up the speakers. So let's do that right now. I'm gonna throw it over to Allison so that we can see what questions there might be in the chat box for us at this point.
Thanks, Cece. I want to remind the audience to go ahead and write your questions into the chat window to the right on your screen. And if you don't see the chat window, if you hover your mouse on the screen, you'll be able to see an option to click on the chat window so that you can see it. At this point, Cece, we don't have any questions in the chat room, but I have a question for you.
Okay.
I love the tip that you made that says, you were saying, make sure to use words and phrases that grab the audience's attention. I think that has been really effective today, and I've noticed that being effective on other webinars and phone calls. But I also noticed you do something today that I wonder if it's intentional or not, and if you could speak to it. I've noticed you using your hands to emphasize certain points. Do you do that intentionally? And what are your thoughts on using that as a tool during a webinar?
Definitely. So that is one of the things that can definitely get lost when you are using technology. And part of, when we're face to face with each other, you do read a lot of body language. Now, we're advantaged today because we have the video technology available to us. And so it's probably a natural consequence of presenting for me, quite honestly. And it's kind of funny because for those of you on the call who are looking at me, I am sitting in a room by myself that feel very connected with you, and you do see that I'm using my hands. So again, when we have the ability to have video, I would make it as natural as you can. Really picture the people in your room and present it in the same way you would if they were in the room with you.
Great. Cece, thank you so much. I guess I let the floodgates go and when I mentioned there were no questions, because we have a bunch of questions now. And awesome. So let's get started on those. I do get a question about how many slides are reasonable for 30 or 60 minutes.
Yeah, and I will give you that horrible consultant answer of it depends. But that's only because it depends on the content. But I think there are some guidelines that you can use. For an example, this is scheduled to be an hour-long webinar, and I have about 15 slides. And so probably the number of slides is possibly not as important depending on how clean they are as if you build in time for interaction. So I think that is really more of the key. So if you find yourself planning a webinar and you have used the whole half hour or an hour with your own speaking, you really want to curtail that back. So you want to leave in an hour presentation a minimum of maybe at least 20 minutes to really make sure you have that interaction so that people are feeling, so it's two-way instead of one-way. So I would say do your best to keep them at a minimum. There's probably not a set number, especially if you're keeping them clean and short. But the key is allowing enough time for interaction and questions.
Great. Thanks so much. We got another question regarding doing a trial run of the full webinar. Maybe you can talk to your experience in doing a full run versus just testing the technology.
Yes, that is a great idea. And I would say if you have the means to do it, it is always a good idea, especially if it's a new technology for you. So as much as you can, making sure your animations are correct, making sure it's projecting. I can tell you, I had a slight heart attack just in the few minutes before here because I remembered that I can't escape out of my presentation without hitting stop share. So it's finding all of those little things and how you navigate. So that is a great best practice. I don't know who said that, but well done.
Yeah, great. Another question came up about muting the lines or not muting the lines. Do you want to talk to that?
Yes, and this is one of those things that, again, can very quickly get away from you. So I'll start from what the most ideal situation is down to what you can do with the most minimum amount of technology. So the most ideal situation, if you can swing it or if the company that you work for has access to it, is to actually have an audio operator system. So there's many out there where people can call in, there'll be a live operator, and then that operator has the ability to queue up audio questions. So everyone will be muted, but they'll have the ability to say that they want to ask the question. And then the operator comes on and very nicely says, we've got a question from Allison from Mundlika. Allison, what's your question? That is ideal in taking audio. Now, that's not always available. So it really is a lot easier if you know the technology and you can mute the speakers and unmute them with the click of a button. I know that's available on things like Skype. It's available here through Zoom, and it really does cut down on that distraction. If you don't have that ability, the best thing that I have found is just to really engage with your participants and say, listen, everybody, we're about to take you off mute. Please mute yourself or we're going to hear your dog in the background and we're going to attempt to start taking questions. And if you keep it casual and everybody knows the limitations that you're working within, they tend to be very forgiving.
Excellent. Cece, another question about presenting instead of on webinar, but on the phone. Anything that you could suggest to our audience about presenting and the cadence to their speech? You know, how quickly or how slowly to speak, and also pauses.
Yeah. And, you know, that's where, again, the tip that I mentioned about word choice and how you grab people's attention, that is something that you want to really concentrate on when you don't have any visuals available to you. And that also may mean repeating some things. So let me say that one more time. Because you can't see me, I know sometimes it's hard to grasp this, so I'm going to describe it one more way. Those are all good techniques to make sure that you have, that you've hit the point. But oftentimes before you do that, it's a good thing to check in with the participants. And on teleconferences, more so than even webinars, it's a good best practice to call on people if you don't get any responses, because silence does not always mean agreement or understanding. So it's a good idea to really, maybe say, hey, Jason, I know she didn't say anything. Does that mean it really resonated, or was there anything that was confusing? So again, having those pauses, repeating when necessary, but doing check-ins are probably the best ways to make sure that your information is hitting the mark and that you're getting the understanding and comprehension on the other side.
Great answer, Cece. Thank you so much. I have another question that's interesting. Some people in the audience are presenting not just PowerPoints, but having to toggle back and forth between Excel files and PowerPoints perhaps, or Word documents. Any words of wisdom when you're doing that?
I'm trying to think. So what I would say there is just, if you have, again, this is where people in the room can really help you. So depending on the technology, I think there's a few different ways you can do it. If you have to toggle between different things, sometimes it's easier to stop sharing and have somebody else share who already has what you need queued up. The other thing I would just say is making sure that everything else is closed aside from what you need to use, so that nothing gets in your way when you're trying to toggle back and forth.
Fantastic.
And Allison, one other thing I would say is, because I know all of us have been on webinars, these are all things that I've found that have worked over the years. But if other people have other tips, maybe answering some of these questions or things that I haven't shared, I would definitely suggest that they add that to the chat box too, because I know that there's a lot of other best practices out there that they're probably utilizing.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And in fact, we got a suggestion from Mark Gamble that says if you're toggling between different files, do not have multiple other files open and the presentation also open. So that is a really great tip. So almost as if you teed that up, Cece.
That's right. Thanks, Mark. That's a great one.
So I did get another question just to see what big mistakes that you see people making when they're giving a webinar. What kinds of things have you seen that are a problem that you would definitely tell them to avoid?
Yeah, I think, some of the biggest problems are obviously not being familiar enough with the technology to know how it works. And like I said, from my example, that goes from something as simple as making sure you have enough battery in your computer to really utilize knowing how to project, and especially the audio portion. I think that's something that we find the most. And so if you don't have that experience, taking the time to practice. But the other things, some of the other things are the things that you find in all presentations, trying to cover too much in too short of a time. So what I would say and encourage you is, as I thought about this presentation as well, there were a whole host of things once I started thinking about that came to my mind. But I really tried to prioritize them, because there's only so much people can take in at one time. And the great part is we could always have another webinar. We can always meet again. But if I can give people enough that they can comprehend in one sitting and then add on to it later, that actually helps their learning. So a lot of the tips that you think of, like I said, for just any presentation that you're giving, apply when you think about especially the content that you want to present over a webinar.
Yep, and I know you have a lot of expertise in training, so you found that those are particularly effective in adult learners and being effective for training situations as well.
Yeah, and the last one is the one that we just kind of did. Some of these questions, I'll be honest, I haven't done a lot of presentations where I had to toggle back and forth. So as we're all have these experiences, and the peer-to-peer interaction is so valuable that throwing it out to somebody else to be able to answer that, if you don't believe you have the best answer, is another great engagement tool, and gives you an opportunity to really celebrate the person that gave an answer, which then encourages more engagement later.
Great. Here's a really interesting question that I see in the chat box, Cece. It's about how long can you expect your audience to stay engaged on the phone? 30 minutes, 60 minutes? What do you think is right?
So I will say probably the longest like webinars that I've done in terms of, you know, kind of a reoccurring standard meeting were an hour and a half. But anytime you get over an hour, you're going to have to mix it up. So oftentimes those fall into two categories when you're over an hour, at least for me, and has been my experience. One category is that I have multiple speakers and multiple topics. So again, you're keeping people engaged by kind of mixing it up. You're letting them know they're going to hear about various topics. The other is when you're really setting up a lot of interaction where people are perhaps going into breakout rooms together and they're able to interact in a different way to keep the content going. But if you're just doing a straight up presentation where you're sharing things, I would not go over an hour, especially with only one speaker. Now, like I said, there will be tons of exceptions to that rules and different content, but that's probably a good guideline to go by.
Yeah, great. You know, Cece, sometimes we're put on the spot and we are not ready to present, and then suddenly someone will say, oh, you know, Allison, hey, could you maybe talk a little bit about something that happened? Any quick suggestions about how to handle that at the moment if you're not too prepared, but you are put on the spot in an important customer situation perhaps, or maybe with your executive leadership?
Yes. So my first tip is to take a breath, right? And we all have probably heard that in presentations when we get asked questions, is to give yourself a chance to take a breath and to remember that you don't have to answer right away. And we can use all of those good tips that we've learned in presentation skills over the years. That's a really interesting question. Or yes, I'd love to answer that. And you feel free to pause and to think, because even though it seems like a lifetime for you, it's still not that bad on over the phone. If you've told people, let me think about that for a second, they'll be patient and they'll wait for you.
Yep, I agree. And it is an uncomfortable situation. And the advice about taking a breath is probably really good advice, because it does give you that extra moment to gather your thoughts.
Yeah.
At this point, Cece, we don't have any further questions in the chat box. So I just want to mention to the attendees, if you have any further questions for Cece, this is a great time to enter them in the chat box. But otherwise, I think we can wrap up for the day.
Okay, well, we do have one more slide and some tips and tricks to share with everybody. And this is one where I've asked Allison to kind of help me with a couple of these, because one we're going to have a little fun with. So let's talk about some other common things that happen throughout the call. And one we just experienced, you have questions in the chat box. So I think we just did a pretty good job at that, but let me show you another way that it can go. 7, I totally agree. Great question. 84. So now, of course, I'm joking in that if I could see the chat box, I would have just answered those questions without reading the question first. But that is such a key element on a webinar. And you would be surprised, I think, at how many of your presenters get into the chat box and they can see it and then they start answering it. The problem with that is if you get many questions, some people may not be looking at the same screen that you are at that time. Additionally, if there are those who have called in today, but they don't actually have access to see the visuals, they're not able to follow along. So of course, my example there was extreme, but it's only to drive home the point of anytime you're taking the questions from the chat box, you want to repeat the questions so those know which one you're answering, as well as anybody who's only got audio will be able to follow along. So next, let's say, and we're probably going to do this in a moment, that you want people to ask audio questions. So Allison and I are going to show what that could look like in some situations. So hi, Allison.
Hi, Cece. How are you? Well, I'm so glad that you're doing this webinar for us. I've been looking forward to it all week. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm so glad that you could join.
Yes, it has been a long time. And when I saw your name pop up on the webinar, I thought, wow, I get to see Cece and catch up. And I hope your daughter's arm is okay. And
oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
well,
oh yeah, do you have a question?
You know, I do actually have a question, and let me ask it now.
All right. So thanks, Allison, for having a little fun with me. But I'd like to ask all of you to put in the chat box, what might be wrong with taking audio questions that way? If you think of, was that the best way to do it, or could it be improved? Are you getting any responses yet, Allison?
I am. Really good responses. People are noting that that can be too casual. We might be talking over one another and there might be too much talking, and you may be wasting time in the chat. They think that there's too much banter back and forth, and maybe people aren't interested in hearing that banter.
Oh, that is so great. Those are all the things. And I'm telling you, that is one of the things that I see most often. And it's for the most positive of intent, is because you want to be friendly with people and you don't want to seem like you're cutting them off. But if there are 50 people on a webinar and each one of them has a question, you are going to lose a lot of time saying, hi, how are you? Great. So it's best to either have a facilitator that can cue people up, or simply, if I had started that interaction knowing that Allison was next and saying, hi, Allison, what's your question? I very much directed her to get to the question. You can imagine, many of you have probably heard those radio shows that callers call in and they say, hello, caller, you're on, what's your question? So you can channel your inner DJ, your inner disc jockey, and really direct the participants on how to be the most effective that they can be. All right, and so last and on my little tips is you're having technical issues. So let's say I'm having a technical issue. I could start moving a lot of papers. My voice could elevate. I could get very excited. However, the best thing is to remember to utilize your team and keep your voice calm. This can be done by simply addressing the issue. Well, it seems like we're having a few audio problems right now. I'm going to put everybody on mute for just a few seconds while we sort this out, and we'll get right back to you. Thank you so much for your patience. That is a great way that allows you to hit mute, have your little crisis moment in the room with your team that you've put together to figure out how you're going to address this problem. And if it lingers longer than you think it's going to, be sure to check in with your participants and make sure that they know you're still working on it. If perhaps you've lost visual or something, and always have a backup plan. Oftentimes we're doing these webinars and we may have different presenters from coast to coast. And just be sure that whoever is running it and knows that they have the ability to effectively communicate with the participants, that they have a backup plan of how they can either cover the material that others were going to cover, or have a backup plan of how to get it to them later. So with that, Allison, I would like to see if there are any last questions, as well as understand if the questions that we answered before, if they were helpful or if they need more clarification.
Yeah, so one comment that we got, which is, I think I felt the same way. When you do have those technical issues, it can be very uncomfortable. So thanks for those tips on helping us to get through those moments. We're getting lots of feedback about excellent tips, Cece. Also, people are suggesting how helpful they are expecting this to be in their future webinars. At this time, we don't have any further questions from the audience. So audience, I do want to give you one last chance to reply before we move forward. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, Cece.
All right, well, I've got one last task, because I think that you all have been such a great audience and really participating, and I appreciate that so much, is did we accomplish our goal? So if you found one or two new tips that you're going to try, if again, just really concisely, you could type in the chat box which ones you're going to try on your next webinar. We'll have Allison read a few of those out and know that we've accomplished our goal, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So Allison, are people got some tips they're going to try in their next webinar?
Yes, they are. One thing that I love is one person, Lei Wan, is saying she's going to show her face when she presents. Speaks to your point about how you're making it personal. I think that's great. The holding slide, a very good tip that I know I haven't personally used before, but is a really good tip. Having a DJ, very helpful. Having someone to answer, ask the questions of you so you're not multitasking and being distracted. That's great. Engaging the audience early, logging into the webinar early, having different assigned roles people are finding useful as well. And another one from Michelle Barzak, holding, early engagement. And that's a great suggestion to get the audience alive and entering the conversation right away. Getting the technology right. And we've gotten multiple people that really like your idea of having the holding slide CC.
Great. Well, I am so glad, and I just thank you, Allison and Jason, for asking me to be a part of your webinar series. And for all of those that called in on the line, thank you for your participation. And like I said, I hope even if you just use one of them, my goal was two, but even if you just use one, I hope it was a good use of your time and that you'll be able to share these with more people too. And as you find out other things that work for you, let's feed those back through SIMDA, and maybe we can talk about that on another webinar. So thank you, Allison.
Thank you, Cece. And I'll encourage everyone to access the other webinars on our SIMDA site, and also to view this one, which will be posted as a recorded webinar there soon. And thank you so much, everyone, for engaging. Thank you especially to Cece for this fantastic webinar with all the great tips and tricks. I look forward to engaging them in my own webinars in the future. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.